This is the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria, session number 13.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hey everyone, it's Matt Sikoria here, and you're joining me for session 13 of the Behavioral Observations Podcast. Now, I am fortunate enough to be joined by Dr. Megan Miller of Navigation Behavioral Consulting today. We have a fantastic discussion about how to provide services to clients over long distances. She has a pretty long track record of doing this, providing services to people in Europe and the Middle East and things like that. And of course, that's just, for those who don't know, she is based here in the States. We talk about best practices for providing supervision regardless of where you are. And we close with a discussion about what are evidence-based practices in the context of clinical practice. You know, we often hear this term evidence-based this, evidence-based that, and especially for those of you who work in educational settings like public schools and things like that, that is a buzzword that you really can't avoid. So we deconstruct that term and talk about what exactly that means for us as BCBAs. And she does a really nice job breaking that down for us. She recently did a presentation about it at the Florida Association for Behavior Analysis. So I think you're really going to like that and like what she has to say about all those topics. Before we get to that, however, I do want to talk a little bit about the recent New Hampshire Association for Behavior Analysis conference. I had the privilege of presenting on a panel of folks who were talking about issues related to practitioner self-care, and it was just a great opportunity to talk to the attendees. I gave about a 15-minute presentation on using surprise, surprise, acceptance and commitment therapy as a way of managing stress, or at least looking at it and thinking about some ways in which we can incorporate some of those concepts into our stress management toolbox. And it was great fun, although it was simultaneously very scary because it was probably the largest group of people I've ever addressed before. I think there was probably about 400 or so people there. So it was not without. It was ironic, I should say, that it was about stress. And the topic was about stress because it was, I could feel my heart kind of pounding out of my chest as I was waiting for my turn to speak. But that notwithstanding, it was just great fun. And I also appreciate many of you who came up to say hello. I met a lot of listeners at the event as well, and it was just a great time. So if you guys have an opportunity to attend New Hampshire ABA next year, I highly recommend it. And I have nothing to do with it other than I ended up talking at it. But the folks who really organized it were the officers of the state chapter, and namely folks like Thea Davis and Kathy Booth. They were instrumental in putting it together, along with a cast of unsung heroes as well. And it was just a first-class event. So I would strongly recommend, wherever you are, and whatever state or province or county, whatever, that has a local ABA chapter, I would strongly suggest going out and supporting those events. There was another one recently that I did not get a chance to go to, the Berkshire, the Babbitt, which I always kind of screw up what the acronym stands for, but it's usually held at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And my friends in podcasting, ABA Inside Track, just published an episode that kind of gave a nice rundown of the happenings out there. So long story short, get out there and support your local chapters. It's a great time, and it's also a great opportunity to kind of network and meet other people who are kind of like-minded behavioral folks. So one last piece of housekeeping before we get on to the episode itself, or the interview itself, is that this episode is sponsored by ABA Outside the Box. Now, ABA Outside the Box is from your friends and mine at bside21.org. ABA Outside the Box is a continuing education series that they are starting, and I participated in their first offering myself, and it all had to do with how to have challenging conversations and using various skills, including some acceptance and commitment skills and things like that, and using those skills to have conversations that are difficult, and how to do those things in a way that lead to the best possible outcome. It was done by Dr. Scott Herbst, and it was very funny, and it was entertaining, and for about $20 you got a nice CE and a nice working knowledge of relational frame theory to boot. He did a really nice job of summing that up in a very succinct manner. So again, you can check out ABA Outside the Box. You can go to bsci21.org /CEUS. Excuse me. That's bsci21.org /CEUS or CEUs. And that will give you all the information that you need to learn more about this great continuing ed opportunity. So now let's get on to the interview. And again, I think you're really going to like what Megan has to offer. She's super sharp, and you're going to learn a lot. So without any further ado, please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Megan Miller. Dr. Megan Miller, thanks for coming on the Behavioral Observations podcast.
Thanks, Matt. It's great to be here. I've been a fan for quite some time now, so nice to be on the other side.
Well, it's good to have you here, because I have a bunch of questions that I want to ask you, because you're doing some really neat things. But of course, what I want to do is, and for those who don't know, when I was trying to arrange this interview, you were saying you're flying off to Dubai soon, and I know you work in Florida and Virginia, and then you have this Ohio State degree and everything like that. So I'm not really sure about all this travel and whatnot and how you get it done. Can you just take a minute and kind of describe not only how you got into behavior analysis, but how does it relate to the traveling that you're doing and things like that?
Sure. So I am not worried about dating myself, I guess, but I started in 2003. Behavior analysis, as it seems to do with most people, just sort of fell into my lap because I had to do an internship for my undergrad, and I had two choices: a mental health hospital or the Cleveland Clinic Center for Autism. And the Cleveland Clinic was 10 minutes from my house, and the mental hospital was 45. So I chose the Cleveland Clinic. What they were doing there was...
Life is a multiple schedule, right?
Exactly. They said that they were doing behavior analysis, and they have come a long way, but they were more or less replicating a lot of the work that Lovas was doing with EIBI. And I didn't learn until I went to grad school that a lot of the actual science of behavior analysis, like functions of behavior and understanding reinforcement and all of that kind of stuff, wasn't really happening. But it was still really powerful to see the progress that the children that went there were making. So when I graduated from undergrad, I worked for a year in Columbus providing in-home ABA therapy while I decided if I wanted to go get my doctorate in clinical psychology or what I really wanted to do. So for whatever reason, I requested information from a bunch of different schools for clinical psych programs. And when I was looking through to decide what I was going to do the following year, I saw that FSU had an ABA program.
I see.
So,
hey, can we just one of the things I wanted to just circle back on real quick. You mentioned at the Cleveland Clinic they weren't doing things. So would you describe that as more of like what we consider behavior modification versus behavior analysis, using very powerful consequences, irrespective of the kind of establishing operations and so forth?
Yes, at that time, they've come a long way as far as I understand it now.
Right. I just wanted to draw. I didn't mean to interrupt your story, but I wanted to kind of just draw that distinction for those who, for those who, for whom that might not be entirely clear. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yep, that's okay. So I looked at FSU's program and I applied, and it was a master's degree, but I had to make a decision between FSU or the Chicago School for clinical psych. And I talked to the coordinator of Chicago School and kind of explained what I wanted to do because I'd already been accepted there the year before for a PsyD. And he was like, you have to go to Florida State.
I see.
So again, I kind of feel fortunate that there was someone in my life because I didn't have a clue. All I knew was that FSU had a program for behavior analysis. I didn't know who Dr. Bailey was. I didn't know how good the program was. I knew it was in the Panhandle, which was way better than Ohio. That was about it.
So you're from Ohio originally?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So I moved down to FSU and I got my master's. And I also felt fortunate because Dr. Murphy, who's one of the professors there, reminded me frequently that I was in a behavior analysis program, not an autism program, because autism is my big area of interest. But they really, at FSU's program, focus on teaching you about the science of behavior analysis and not just one population. So, after I graduated, I didn't do anything super exciting, took some jobs, worked. I was the clinical coordinator at FSU for a year and a half. Then I moved to Virginia, and I just was really fortunate. I constantly want to learn and make connections with people. So when I would go to conferences, I would, talk to people from all over the place. And that's kind of how you and I have met.
That's true.
And I just have met a lot of behavior analysts that way. So one of my first experiences with doing international consultation was I met Robert Schramm, who's a behavior analyst that lives in Germany. And we kind of had similar approaches to dealing with escape as a function of behavior. So that's something we could talk about at some point if you want. But he was overwhelmed with work in Germany, so he had a few people contact him for services, and I was just getting started working for myself, so I had a ton of free time. And he referred a family from Italy to me. So my first international consultation was in Italy, and then he later referred a family from Serbia, so I went to Serbia. And then out of the Italy family, I met a few people that were working towards certification. So I started supervising them. And from that, just kind of like word of mouth referral, I ended up with somebody. I had a few people in Italy, someone in Australia, and now I supervise a few people in the UK and Scotland.
Okay. So,
and then
this is too interesting not to interrupt. I'm sorry. So did when you started working with Robert, did you do this remotely or did you actually travel to, Serbia, Italy, et cetera? How did it all work?
So, I didn't actually work with him. He just connected me with the families because he couldn't. Yeah. But so I went there. I went to Italy twice and I went to Serbia 2 or 3 times. The Italy trips were both very quick though. I got there and I went immediately straight from the airport to consultation, and I was there for like a day and a half and then I left. So those were very tiring. Okay. I was younger and it was a lot easier to do. And then like we would, for all of these, we would do Skype or whatever method that the parents wanted to do for consultation in between. It's not funded by insurance or anything like that. So it's really whatever the parents are wanting to do is fine as long as they consent to it. And they would send me videos, send me their data, and I would review it, write the programs, update things. We would have meetings. So it's very similar to the model that you see for in-home programs here. The only difference is you're not physically there in person to do some of the stuff. So sometimes things will come up where you're wanting to physically get in there and show them something with the child and you can't. So that makes it a little tricky. So I've had a couple times where I would make a video with one of my other colleagues and have them pretend to be the child so I could model.
Oh, that's pretty
whatever.
Clever. That's a neat little, I guess the kids will say that's a hack. So were these programs were the parents providing the services, or were the interventions, or did they have their own behavioral therapist doing the frontline work, or a little bit of both? Or
Yep, it was for most of the cases it's been that they've hired people similar to how families do here, like college students or whatever. And then there are some people in different places that have backgrounds, like the one family, the person was working on becoming certified. So,
nice.
So that helps. the big thing, I also do distance work in the States. So I've had a few clients who live just kind of in the middle of nowhere in like Ohio or different states. And they would get in touch with me somehow or another. And I have a similar setup. I meet them in person. Obviously I can do it more often. That way I would try to do like monthly. But the biggest factor for like effective services is really how well the line therapists implement what you're training them to do, which again, and of course the parents, how on board they are, which to me is very similar to just when you're providing regular in-person services. But the difference is when you're doing the distance work, you have to have at least one person who's willing to make sure things are happening as they should be and is really thorough about like taking the data and like checking on making sure that whatever programs I wrote are actually being run how they're supposed to be, because I'm not there, weekly to check on it. So what the main like issue I would run into is if the team wasn't strong, and I would do my best to try to train them and do different, integrity checklists and things like that. But I had a couple situations where I needed to refer out because their teams just wouldn't do what I was trying to teach them to do. But I have that experience with in-home without being distanced too. So
some of these are more universal considerations, and perhaps the differentiating factor is just the as you were saying earlier, not being able to get in there and model or problem solve in a way that requires physical contact or what have you. Yeah. So but
and you have to be flexible with your time too, because there's a time difference. So like, are you
on Skype at like 3 a.m. or something like that? Or?
No, I haven't had to do that yet. But for some of them, I'll be doing like meetings on a Sunday morning at 7 a.m. or something like that. So if you're not really flexible with your time, for whatever reason, then it makes it a lot harder to coordinate, the schedules for that.
I see. Now, just to be, from a technical standpoint, are you using any type of, or how are the data getting to you? Are they graphing these in like a Google Lab type cloud thing, or if you've tried a couple of different things, can you give us kind of a range of ways in which this has been done and what your experiences have been with each?
So when I first started, they would just scan their data sheets and send them to me, and then I would look at them, and that was pretty time consuming. Then I tried using Google Forms for one family, but they didn't really fill them out as they should. So the most successful thing that I've been doing so far, and again, this is partially because the person that's providing the therapy is so diligent about making sure he fills out the forms, is we have a HIPAA secure box account, and we have a spreadsheet in there. So he takes the data and then he puts it into the spreadsheet, and then it graphs the performance. So that's been the most successful so far. And they've been using the data sheets. I don't typically use, but Dr. Mike Mueller assisted with this consult, and he provided some of the resources from his CD, the one of the data graphing CDs from like the big book, and he has like a data CD-ROM thing. So he provided that, and the person working on the team really took to that. Like, it was really simple for him to understand and easy. So that's another thing I've learned over time is I like to provide pretty complex programs sometimes. So with a lot of the distance stuff, I have to I make it simple and feasible for people anyway, but with distance, it's usually like as simple as you can make it. So sometimes like the data, I don't normally do percentage. I usually do cold probe data. And for this case, we're doing percentage because it was just a lot easier to gather the information that way. And it was a lot easier for the person providing the services to understand. So
I see. Tell me a little bit about, I have to imagine there's some obvious language barrier unless these are American expatriates, living abroad. So when you're teaching manding or tacting or what have you, so do you end up having to get like some phrase book or something like that in Italian or German or whatever? Or
No, I didn't have to. All of the families I have worked with no speak English, but they, speak Italian or Serbian or whatever other language. But there were a couple of things. One, for one of the families, they would just kind of translate for me to tell me what was happening, or like when I supervise if I need to. But a lot of it, I'm so familiar with the programs, even though I don't speak the language, when I watch them do it, I can figure out what they're saying. Now, if you then told me to like tell the child the same commands in Italian or whatever language, I wouldn't be able to do it. But in the context, when you can see what they're doing, you can understand, what's being asked and what the response was. With some of the families or some of the programs that I've supervised, the skills that they're working on are so small that only like one word is being said at a time. So then I was kind of learning the language with the child, which was kind of interesting. But it's definitely, I have had a few families try to get services that didn't speak English. And that wasn't possible because I need to have somebody that I can talk to like this, and then they kind of translate, and then they can explain to me what's going on if I don't understand.
I see. Okay, yeah, because that's obviously one of the first questions that popped into my mind about how does this all work, and I mean, I guess if you hear like a phrase and the kid touches his head, or or something like that, then that's hopefully he said, the therapist said, touch your head, or whatever the instruction is. So that's pretty cool. So you mentioned kind of referring out when the team wasn't really implementing the services in a way in which I guess, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that you were comfortable with. Are there some other ethical considerations to working, in these types of circumstances that may not necessarily be present in a, kind of conventional either in-home therapy or clinic therapy or even school consultation?
There's a couple. I think one is obviously just that the transmission of the data. So like if you're using email or Skype or whatever, making sure that the families understand the security risks inherent with that. And if they want like a more secure system, that you're able to offer that to them. Mm-hmm. A lot of the families I've worked with prefer Skype. So I'm, if that's what they're comfortable with, I don't stray from that. I just let them know that it's, not HIPAA secure. But in those countries, they don't even have HIPAA, obviously, because that's an American thing. So, and then, but like when you're sending back information back and forth about the child, so that's why for the, we've started using the Box account where, they have their own folder in there, and we put the programs and everything in there. And that makes it nice too, because when you have multiple people working on the team, they can all just like go in that folder and see, what they need to see for the child. So that's been helpful.
You're not emailing stuff back and forth or, yeah.
Right. I mean, we email some stuff. It just kind of depends on, what they want to do and whatnot. But, and then the biggest one is knowing your competencies, which, I mean, technically you should do for any client. But when you add that distance factor in, your competencies they may be different because, it's one thing to be able to sit in person with someone and model something and teach them something, but to be able to explain that from a distance, like over Skype, like this, in a way that they can understand and then implement is a little bit different. And then being able to recognize when you're not able to be effective. So like for the family that I referred out, because for whatever reason, the team wasn't listening to what I was trying to teach them to do, it wasn't effective. So I had to refer them to, there was like a clinic that was a little bit closer. Or like in Italy, the reason that case ended was because the child got older and he needed a lot more work on social skills. And that's really hard to do from a distance and when you don't speak the language fluently.
Oh, yeah.
So, it's kind of a mutual decision of, now some time has passed. There's some more behavior analysts in the area. It would be better suited to have someone in person who can work on these things and speaks Italian.
Do you see a change in international referrals based on the proliferation of behavior analysts abroad. I don't know if proliferation is probably too strong a word, but at least the increasing number of behavior analysts outside of North America?
I mean, it's definitely really neat to see all the countries that now have behavior analysts and are able to start supporting their own services. What I see is sort of an increase in wanting that extra consultation. So people with more experience, like myself, but even, more experience than me that have already been kind of doing this type of thing, but like Dr. Carbone or people from the New England Center for Children, people from the CARD out of California, some of those like bigger companies, they go out and help train the people that are actually living in the country. So I think there's a little bit more like skill refinement type training that is happening than like me being the consultant that works directly with a family. It's more like going out and training the newly certified people or the people that are trying to become certified.
Right.
One of the issues that I've encountered, and I won't identify any specific places, but what I've seen happen, and this is kind of something we might talk about at the end, is people accepting positions for some of these international jobs where they're just looking for, and this happens here too. This isn't just international, but I think it's
Sure.
more difficult if it's international because you don't have as many people to reach out to, but accepting like a leadership position as a director of a brand new center in a different country and you just got certified. So especially if you're younger, like in your early 20s and you just got certified, you don't have much life experience and you don't have much experience as a behavior analyst, 40 kids, and you're supposed to determine what to do with all of them.
Oh yes,
So,
I've seen that. I've seen that in my backyard here in New England. So yeah, that's something to for everyone to be kind of wary of, especially and from the staff member's role or perspective, I could see that there's all sorts of reinforcers for getting out there and. I got this certification and degree now, and kind of wanting to change the world and things like that. But yeah, it's good advice to understand one's limitations and experience level and things like that. It's got to be really tough though, and it's hard for me to kind of put myself in that perspective because I've been doing this for a little while, and as I like to joke around with folks, I took the BCBA exam on paper and pencil to give people some perspective. It's just such a different world today, and there's so many positions available and things like that. So thank you for bringing that up. So. One other thing I wanted to talk to you about is, and just to kind of segue here a little bit, but I think it is related in some respects, is you and I were talking a little while ago about you recently gave a talk at the Florida Association for Behavior Analysis on evidence-based practices, and I thought it would be a timely thing to review here on the podcast. I know a lot of the listeners to the show work in schools in particular. And in schools, evidence-based practices, oh my gosh, it's such a buzzword. And everything's got to be evidence-based this, evidence-based that. Mind you, no one can really define what that means, but they think as long as there was an article written about it, that it is such, that something's been, labeled with that, and so. Can you give us kind of like a thumbnail sketch about what your talk entailed about evidence-based practices?
Sure. So I did this presentation with Steve Ward, and we called it Make ABA Great Again, because we're a little concerned about the tendency of the field to be hyper-focusing on this evidence-based practice concept. Not saying we shouldn't be using evidence-based practice, but that, like you're saying, it doesn't seem to be a clear consensus about what that even means. So we should kind of get back to understanding what that is and how to operate as behavior analysts based off of that. So and I'm hoping to make like a more in-depth webinar about it to help educate people and disseminate information. But sort of the brief takeaway is there's a few definitions of evidence-based practice, and the one that we are trying to encourage people to consider from Slocum et al. In 2014. And it's also used in medical models for evidence-based practice in speech language pathology. So it's in a similar context to what we do. Other disciplines use the same definition. So it kind of makes sense that we would use it as well. We already separate ourselves by defining other things differently. So this might help us get on the same page. But basically, it's looking at a decision-making process. So a lot of times when people think of evidence-based practice, they think of a list of procedures that have research or don't have research. But what Slocum et al. Advocates is that we look at it as a decision-making process, and it integrates three things: the best available evidence, your clinical expertise, and then the client values and context. So rather than just saying, I'm not sure if you're on any of the Facebook pages, but you may see, if you are, that I have had a few situations occur where there's a conversation that will start about the Early Start Denver model, for example. And people will say, oh, that's not on that list by, the National Autism Center or whatever. But if I'm just looking at that list, then I could miss out on the whole process of, well, let's look at the evidence that's out there for it. Let's use my clinical expertise and what I know about early childhood development and the clients that I've worked with and what's worked well for them and what the data are showing. And then, of course, the client values and context. There's a lot of families that it's more appealing to them to use a more developmentally based approach where you're playing and engaging in naturalistic activities. And out of all of the things out there, Early Start Denver model has the most evidence behind it for that type of approach. So if that's what the client values, then that might be your most, appropriate solution. So that's part of it, is just looking at, when you're deciding a course of action for a client, do you just look at a list of procedures, or are you able to integrate and engage in like a problem-solving process to determine what's most appropriate for your client? And then also within that, what is important to understand is those lists aren't bad. That would be looking at the best available evidence, but the recommendation is to call that empirically supported treatments to be consistent with other fields and just amongst ourselves. So when we're saying, floor time or sensory integration isn't an evidence-based practice, it would be more appropriate to say it's not an empirically supported treatment, because the evidence-based practice is your problem-solving decision-making process, and the empirically supported treatments are one aspect of that you look at when you're deciding what to do. So we kind of talked about that and making that distinction. And then we also talked about how it's important to make sure you're not losing sight of the fact that as a behavior analyst, you should be analyzing things. So it used to be, when I first started in the field, which was not that long ago, it wasn't that short ago either, but it wasn't that long ago, that assessments like the ABLS and the VB-MAP and the AFLs and all, the letters you want to throw out there didn't exist. So what did behavior analysts do when those assessments didn't exist? They met a client, they took data, they got baseline levels, they talked with the family, they figured out what skills were, deficient. If there were problem behaviors, they analyzed those, and then they wrote up programs and plans, and they had nothing to refer back to. Maybe they used some standardized things, like if they were in that, but most people were just taking like observational data and writing programs. So using a lot of those analytical skills to really drill down and figure out, what is the problem and what are the solutions. But nowadays, go ahead.
So going back to the Early Start Denver model, even though it might have, and I can't cite the evidence off the top of my head here, but based on what you were saying, if it has less empirical support than other interventions, there might be pieces of it that are consistent with behavior analytic processes that you could say, in this situation, based on my knowledge of the science of human behavior, I know this component of the Denver model, in conjunction with these family values, this family's particular set of values, is a good fit here. Is that kind of putting those three things together?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And go ahead.
No.
Oh, so that's part of it. I mean, really, like, I don't really think a whole lot of programs right now are training clinicians in that way. It's more, here's the ABLES, here's the VB map, here's these assessments, these are these behavioral things that you do, as opposed to teaching, like, here's how you do a literature review and find not just the things published in JAVA, but the different things for the population you're working with that could be behavior analytic in nature. And this is how you piece that together to make a comprehensive program for your client that will be effective. So that's kind of what we were talking about. That is what people used to do because these assessments didn't exist. So you used your knowledge of behavioral science to develop your different interventions, we seem to be we have gotten away from that, really. People are being trained on how to write programs from the VB map, or how to write programs, based on whatever published material is out there, as opposed to really looking at the client and the needs of the family and applying the science of behavior analysis.
Yeah, that's a topic that's come up on the podcast a couple of times. The first time it came up was, I think, in my conversation with Todd Ward, and, one of his kind of parting pieces of advice was something to the effect of, not looking at behavior analysis as an autism treatment per se, but more so as a broad science of human behavior. And it's more than, I think he and I were joking around, it's more than the VB map and an analog functional analysis. And so I could see from your perspective the kind of danger of over manualizing the field. On the other hand, however, I can also see that those curricula present tremendous value, especially to those, kind of underserved populations, or if you're in a behavior analyst and maybe don't have a ton of experience, and perhaps you're living in you're not living within the the 128 ring around Boston, where there's probably the densest population of behavior analysts in the world. That those curricula could be of tremendous value. So it's I don't know. I can kind of argue both sides of that, but I understand the need to be have a broad base of understanding of behavior analysis and be able to look at a situation, figure out what's going on, and design an effective treatment in the absence of those tools.
Right. And we're definitely, I don't think that I'm constantly using whatever resources are available. It doesn't make sense. We are all strapped for time. It doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel. The main thing is, so part of the focus of this talk was on training supervisees. So are we training future behavior analysts to engage in this evidence-based practice model decision-making process, or are we training them to just be interventionists, to implement manualized treatment? And so one of my favorite articles that I read in preparation for this talk was from Leaf et al. In 2016. And it was kind of talking about the same idea regarding, are we training behavior analysts or interventionists? How we need to make sure we're training people to be flexible and analytical and not rigid and non-responsive, because you'll get, you'll see it on Facebook, you'll see it in listservs, you'll see it out in the field where people say, well, I only take discrete trial data using this data sheet,
right.
Or I only use first response data, or I only use errorless prompting. The prompting hierarchy has to be like this. And, that's not flexible, that's not analytical, and it's not responsive. So, and one of the things that Leaf pointed out too was that it takes time to develop clinical judgment. So while some of these manualized treatments are great for training people as interventionists and helping them learn the initial aspects of our field, if you're truly going to become a behavior analyst and then go out and train other people, we should be developing those analytical skills and teaching how to understand, the process of in the moment being able to make decisions about a case based on the child's responding, and not just following like, well, this is what I was taught to do. This is, I have to follow this task analysis.
We have to move on to Man 7M.
Right.
Where was that article published?
Oh, let me see.
If you don't have it, I'll get it later. We'll put it in the show notes so people can check it out.
There were 2 Leaf articles, so I get them confused, but I think it was. Yeah, I'll give you there it is. Is it this one?
It's not the social thinking is pseudoscience
article.
No,
this is the let's see. I'm pretty sure this is the right one.
This is great podcasting.
This
folks.
Is so. Sorry,
no, it was I'm just
journal.
Joking with you. I was gonna cue the Jeopardy theme. No,
I'm horrible at memorizing. The fact that I could even tell you Leaf is pretty good.
No, that's fine.
It was in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, and it's called "Applied Behavior Analysis is a Science and Therefore Progressive." And I think that's something some people are missing out on, because when new research is coming out that like progresses early research, they just want to hold on to the early research and say, well, we already figured that out, 20 years ago. And it's like, but new things have happened. Sure. We need to take that into account.
Yeah. And that's tough, especially for people in, my Generation X and beyond, because so it's good to keep that in mind. And I was just kidding about, and I really appreciate you running down that resource. And again, that's Leif et al. 2016 out of the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disabilities or Development Disorders. I forget what it is. But long story short, I will post that in the show notes. So if people go to behavioralobservations.com and I think this will be session 13. So I'll have that reference in there. So thanks for bringing that up. What else was something else popped into my mind as you were explaining that. Oh, okay. Yeah. So you do supervision. So what advice or what are some good practices from a supervisory standpoint to make sure people aren't falling into this pattern of being interventionists as opposed to behavior analysts? I can imagine, just like we were saying a few minutes ago, it's awfully tempting to over rely perhaps on some of these things, and I can imagine if that you are, let's say you're a special education teacher and you're doing an online program in behavior analysis, and you've got a couple of kids, and fill in the blank of all these kind of time constraints and things like that. How do you? I guess the question is how do you inspire, to use a very kind of non-technical word, or how do you motivate people to, or how do you set the occasion for thinking in a more broad behavior analytic way as opposed to some of the ways in which we've been talking about?
So that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. I think this is an area that could use some more research. Speaking of research,
right.
What I personally do, and it's basically, I could tell you the behavioral principles this ties to, or you might be able to figure them out as I talk about it. But basically what we try to do is kind of use like an errorless prompting procedure where the first few months of supervision, we're mostly just giving kind of that manualized intervention type process where we, discuss the cases and talk about this is what, we would do in this situation. And it's more of kind of like an apprenticeship type deal where you're just really modeling for them, these are the types of things I would do. But I don't just say, okay, well, for this child, then we need to do imitation training. or, it sounds like he's attention seeking, we need to put in a planned ignoring, I would talk it out, talk out loud about that thought process so that they can hear, what it is that you're thinking about when you're looking at this. So one of the things that I've really pushed Steve Ward to do is, when I first met him, he's just a brilliant behavior analyst. Like one of those people who just is naturally can analyze something in a second, and you're just watching, he, sees a client and he's like, well, have you done this? Did you try that? And you're like, why didn't I think of that?
Oh, I feel so stupid when I meet those people.
So yeah. So I told him, I was like, Steve, I want to be like you, but I don't know how to be like you. I need you to put all of your thoughts on paper so that I can learn how to do these things. And he has, so that's great.
Nice.
So, trying to kind of go through that process so that they can see how you're analyzing the situation as opposed to just telling them the answer. And of course, there is research on think aloud problem solving, TAPS. So this is kind of, the reverse of that to start with. It's the supervisor doing the thinking aloud so that the supervisee can have exposure to that. And then I do kind of two things. One, I'll sort of back off. So if like a similar situation arises than what we've already had, I'll say, okay, we've encountered this before. What should we do? And I try to have them work through that process as opposed to just continuing to like feed them the answers. And if they're not analyzing it and they're just kind of like guessing or throwing things out there, then I'll start to add in more prompts to. Yeah, exactly.
There's lots of screaming.
So then I'll start to ask them questions to help them analyze it. Like, well, you said he's having difficulty when you're standing in the front of the class and presenting an instruction to the group. So what do you think could be going on there? And I start to, try to help them work through that process. Sometimes it doesn't happen that things replicate themselves. You'll have new issues come up. But once we're about halfway through supervision, regardless of if it's a situation they've encountered before or not, I really start to try to back off completely and start having them think aloud and problem solve and go through that process. So that's kind of like just what I've been doing, and it seems to work well to help people start to think that way, but it's not really based off any specific literature. I mean, there is, literature out there on staff training and using behavioral skills training initially, and we try to incorporate that type of stuff and then sort of flip it so that they're the ones kind of coming up with the ideas. And then, of course, the think aloud problem solving. Mary Sawyer, who also was doing the presentation with us, she's at Aubrey Daniels Institute. She actually did her dissertation at Ohio State on training teachers to engage in evidence-based practice and engage in that problem solving. And she came up with like a manual where she does something similar where they do some examples together where there's like a problem identified and she helps them engage in the process of problem solving and then gives them feedback. It's based on behavioral skills training. And then they practice it with a new set of examples, but without that prompting and assistance. And then they apply it to the classroom. And her data for that turned out really well to show that they were able, at baseline, they didn't engage in any of the problem solving really, but then they were able to apply it to the classroom. So I think I'm hoping, at some point, some of her materials may be available for people to look at, because I think we could apply that same concept to the people that we're supervising to become behavior analysts.
Very cool. Yeah, it's one of those things that some of the conversations I've had recently with folks at conferences and get-togethers and things like that is becoming more savvy about how we actually run our practice, and perhaps the next wave of organizational behavior management is going to be, it started out kind of going out from applied behavior analysis, and it's going to kind of boomerang back in, as the field grows and as these kind of practice-wide pressures exist, and so what are those ways in which we can provide supervision or run an organization, frankly, so it's a timely issue. So
Yep. And one of the things we've been doing, sorry, just to kind of
keep going.
Piggyback off of that. So what I've seen as an issue with a lot of people that are doing supervision is they're all strapped for time. Mm-hmm. We all are. As behavior analysts, there's always too much work out there for us. So what we've done for our company in Virginia is we have our behavior analysts who we don't just like assume it as part of their job to do BACB supervision. So they have to do supervision, for insurance, and they have to write programs and all that kind of stuff. But we know that providing the BACB supervision at the level required is a whole other task in and of itself. So when we have supervisees, we work with each of the BCBAs to assign them to a supervisee. And if they're doing that, we pay them a little bit extra for each person they're supervising, and we make sure that they have time allotted for that task. And I think that's helped a little bit too, to ensure that they're able to focus on, providing quality supervision as opposed to trying to squeeze in supervising on top of the, 60 hours a week that they're working with clients or what. I mean, we I hope don't make our people work that hard, but I know some places that do, that, they're working 60 hours a week, plus they're supposed to be doing field work supervision on top of that. And it turns into just signing off on a paper. And there's not, the formal supervision process that the BACB is looking for.
Sure. So you mentioned your company. Can you take a minute and tell us a little bit of what it is and what it's about? What do you do and where and all that fun stuff?
So one of the many projects in my life. So the company is called Navigation Behavioral Consulting, and it's in the Virginia Beach area. We serve pretty much the whole Hampton Roads Tidewater. So it's Virginia Beach, Norfolk, Chesapeake, Newport News, Williamsburg. It's like this whole, not the whole East Coast of Virginia, but a good portion of it. Mm-hmm. And we provide in-home behavior analytics services, and we try to do a model where we have, the lines therapists that are receiving training, and a lot of them are doing field work. And then we have newly certified BCBAs who provide some supervision, but mostly one-on-one because we're training them to become more supervisory. And then the more experienced behavior analysts provide a bulk of the supervision. And they help, sort of train the newly certified people to become more experienced with supervision. There's no assumption that just because you're certified, you can do, what a lot of places would think you can do. So we make sure people have the skill set before we put them in a role. And we have, I do distance supervision, and then we try to do dissemination in the community and bring in different presenters and things like that to help train people in the community. And then we have some online stuff. Right now, we just have the 8-hour supervision course and an ethics webinar, but I have a whole list of other webinars. It's just finding the time to put them together.
Yeah, so. I hear you. And so how many BCBAs do you think you have roughly right now working at Navigation?
We have myself and Lori, my business partners, are the two BCBAs, obviously. And then we have about 8 other BCBAs, and we have 2 BCABAs. And then we have 3 BCABAs, sorry. And then the rest are technicians.
Very cool. Very cool.
So the rest is about 10 or 15 people as technicians.
And where can people go if they want to learn more?
Our website is navigateaba.com.
Navigateaba.com. And for those of you who are driving, don't worry. We'll put that in the show notes. Don't do anything I wouldn't do, as the saying goes. So we'll have those resources listed in the show notes. All right, cool. Sounds like a great organization. And again, that's navigateaba.com. So I know you are jetting off to the Middle East here. So I know we were joking about not having time to kind of get ready to travel and all that stuff before we hit the record button. So I want to be respectful of your time and let you go here shortly. So, in closing, what advice would you have to students of behavior analysis or aspiring behavior analysts and so forth?
So my biggest takeaway point would be you don't know what you don't know. So whether you're a student of behavior analysis or if you're already certified, that's one great thing about this field. If you like to learn, you'll never stop learning. So sometimes it can be tempting once you're finished with your coursework and you've worked so hard to do your supervision and get those letters behind your name to think you can now go conquer the world. But keep in mind that once you're finished with all of that, there's still a lot of learning to do. Almost every client and situation you encounter will be different. So you'll need to have some mentors and people that you can turn to. I didn't really talk about it in the initial part where I talked about my kind of background ABA, but when I first graduated from FSU, that was one of the greatest lifesavers for me because some of my first clients, man, it was fortunate because I actually came up with the right ideas, but being able to email Dr. Murphy and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking about doing for this situation, and having him tell me, yes, that's exactly right, was wonderful. And I still have people that I bounce ideas off of now and go to conferences and learn more about. One of my favorite experiences as a behavior analyst was going to Morningside for their teacher train. They do like a summer institute every year, and with Kent Johnson. And he's, one of you've probably read studies by him. He's been in the field for quite some time, and he's definitely knows his stuff. And he runs in a very effective business where they don't even the students that go there make so much progress every year. They have a money back guarantee where if the student doesn't catch up a year's worth or 2 years worth in the year that they're there, they'll give the money back. And they've only had to do like 2% or something. It's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. So they make huge gains, and he's still constantly refining what they're doing, constantly reading new research and figuring out how to improve their model.
I've always wanted to visit there. Yeah.
It's amazing. It's so amazing. And if he's, in his probably 60s, I don't want to date him. I don't know how old he really is, but he's probably around there. And he's doing that, then just think about what we should be doing in our 20s, 30s, 40s. Sure. So that's one of my big things. And then the other one is to play nice in the sandbox. There's some blogs out there that you could find. Molly Mills Shepherd wrote my favorite one. She's a mother of a child with autism, but also a BCBA. And she was a BCBA before being a mother of a child with autism. And she kind of talks about how behavior analysts can come off as a little bit of jerks sometimes. So recognizing that we don't know everything and that other fields do have something to contribute to the conversation is really important. I've learned a ton, by being a little bit open-minded. And when I work with the 0 to 3 population, looking at the developmental literature, and of course, some of the ways they talk about things is not how a behavior analyst would talk about it. But if you can read it and then, take away the parts that you could apply and make behavioral, you can make a lot more gains with your clients than completely pretending like that stuff doesn't exist. So those are my two biggest takeaways. Have a way to get mentorship and continued training and build your competencies, and then be nice to other fields and work collaboratively with them.
Very cool. Well, perfect advice to end on. So thanks so much for taking time out of your travel arrangements and sofa packing, etc., to chat with us. And
sure.
I wish you safe travels, and we'll have to have you back on the show again to talk more about this stuff. Megan Miller, thank you very much, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Matt.
All right, take care. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. I certainly learned a lot, and I want to let you know that we will have all of those references that Megan mentioned in our show notes. So head on over to behavioralobservations.com, session 13, And we'll have all those links there for you, so you don't have to do anything unsafe while you're driving or walking your dog or mowing your lawn or what have you. I also want to ask you a small favor. If you like this episode or any of the other episodes in the podcast series, then head on over to iTunes and leave me a rating and review. It really helps drive the dissemination of this show and, by extension, applied behavior analysis. And there's a gazillion podcasts out there, and so having more ratings and reviews just makes this show more visible. And so if you have a second to do that, that would be great. Finally, I just want to remind you guys that this show is indeed sponsored by bsci21.org's ABA Outside the Box series, which is offers continuing education. So if that's something you're interested in, head on over to bsci21.org/CEUS or bsci21.org/CEUs. That's all I have for now, so I will see you in session 14 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. Thanks for listening.
Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.